Good morning, everybody. You are listening to the VBAC link, and today is the first episode without Julie. And let me tell you, I am already missing her so much. It's going to be a little different, not having this podcast with her. I was just telling our guest today how weird, I don't even know what episode number we're on right now because Julie was such the backbone. She did all the technical, little detail things. And I am going to have to get used to that. So bear with me as I'm weaning into doing all the podcast stuff by myself. But today we have our friend Rebecca, and she is going to share her story. And guys, she has a special scar, or a cervical extension, I should say, that ended up being a special scar. And we don't have a ton of these types of episodes on the podcast. They're not as common. And one of the reasons why I'm personally excited for her to share her story is because they're not as common, but they're still possible. And so we really want to get the word out there that, do your research and do what's comfortable for you, but know that it's possible. And something that's also a little different about her story is it was from the cervical extension. So I can't wait for her to share a little bit more about this. And we're going to talk about more of what a cervical extension even means and what that looks like and what it could mean for future vaginal births. But of course, we have a review of the week. And normally I would turn the time over to Julie, but we don't have Julie. So I am going to read you a review of the week. Today's review is by Sarah, and she said, 1 month ago, had a successful VBAC induction just 18 months after my cesarean section. I almost called to schedule a repeat on my due date because I was so scared. Then I found your podcast and listened to it for 2 days straight. It gave me the courage to go through with an induction, and I'm so glad I did. Hoping more people find this as a resource. Oh, that's awesome. It looks like she emailed us that. We love reviews. As you know, we have Apple Podcasts, we have Spotify, we have Google Play, we have just Google. You can leave us a review on Google, but just like Sarah did, you can email us a review. So if you've had a good experience or if there was something that you would like to share with the world, please email us. Feel free, and we will slap this into the review queue and maybe read it on the next podcast.
You are tuned into the VBAC Link podcast with Megan Heaton, who is a longtime doula and VBAC mom herself, here to help you get inspired for birth after having had a C-section. Along with this podcast, the VBAC Link offers blogs, resources, and a comprehensive VBAC course for both parents preparing for birth and doulas wanting to take their VBAC education to the next level. Be sure to follow Megan and her team on all social media platforms for even more. Although these podcast episodes are VBAC specific, it is encouraged for all expectant moms to listen and educate themselves on how to avoid a C-section from the get-go. The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is not meant to replace advice from any other qualified medical professional. Here is your host, Megan.
Okay, Miss Rebecca, we are so excited to have you. We thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share the stories of your 3 kiddos, right? You have 3?
Yep, 3 girls.
3 girls. You're a girl mama. That is so awesome. And remind me, they're all pretty close, like 4, 3, and 1?
Yep,
yes.
That's right.
4, 3, and 1. That is so awesome. So you are really busy in your life.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Are you guys planning on having more? Do you have any idea if you're wanting any more?
I've always liked even numbers, so probably have one more.
Yeah.
But we joke that each one gets spaced out further and further apart. So not anytime soon, at least.
Yes. But hey, you know what? Sometimes I think Julie had this too, where all of her kids are really, really close. And it might be chaotic right now when they're little, but then they're the best of friends and they're all in the same time zone. Like my sister and I, we're 3 years apart and it's still not that very far, but I love that when they're really close, you're always going to school together and you're kind of in the same friend zones and in the same types of things. So it might be chaotic when they're little, but so fun. I bet
it'll be worth it.
It will be so awesome. So awesome. Well, cool. Well, thank you for joining us today. And I would love to turn the time over to you to tell us about these beautiful girls' births.
Okay, well, my first birth was very uncomplicated. Pretty much the only strange thing that happened was my water broke at 37 weeks in the middle of the night. And I was totally unprepared because everyone says that first time moms go to like 42 weeks. And so I just wasn't even in my mind, like thinking that was possible. But it was a great birth. Lasted about 10 hours, labor did. It was unmedicated. I didn't have any tearing. And it was just kind of like textbook, I guess, in that way. And then when my daughter was about 4 months old, I started coming down with what I thought was the flu. And then I all of a sudden started having some food aversions, which was weird. And so I had asked my doula, I was like, is this like normal, like postpartum? Like, are my hormones regulating or what's going on? And she was like, Rebecca, you need to go take a pregnancy test. And it was like, positive. I was like in denial. She said she knew for like a week before I did.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I was just in denial. So that put their due dates within 12 months from one another. So both October. And it was just a very difficult like pregnancy, emotionally, physically. I had to give up nursing because I'm one of those that like dries up when I'm pregnant, and I just felt a lot of guilt. And my husband seemed to be like completely like just unaware of how hard it was going to be, where I was like, do you understand like having two kids 12 months apart? This is going to be very hard. Anyways, so with her, I was expecting to go into labor early. 37 weeks came, rolled around, no baby. 38 weeks came, 39. And finally, like after my due date, I went into labor, which already felt like I was 3 weeks overdue just because my first daughter came 3 weeks early. So it was just so mental at that point. But we got to the hospital and I was already 9 centimeters. So we thought this baby was coming. And I pushed for 4 hours and she would not come out. She ended up, they called in like the senior midwife and she was like, the baby's OP. And so they, were having me do all the things, what's it called? The Walters.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
That's intense. Like,
it was terrible. It was really painful. But it was like, they just could not get her to turn into a favorable position. They tried manually turning her. And I still didn't have that epidural at that point. And finally the midwife was like, was wanting to call it. And I said, what are my options? And she's like, a C-section. And I was like, well, how about we do an epidural and see if that relaxes me. And then you can try turning the baby. So I was just trying at that point, like willing to try whatever. So they agreed. They let me sleep for a few hours and they came back in. It was the middle of the night and they started manually turning her and she was responding to it. But then all of a sudden she just started having heart decels down to the 30s and they like freaked. And then they're like, okay, they're like, okay, we're not doing that. And they're like, okay, we'll let you try to push her out, just sunny side up essentially. And so I pushed and she started descending, but then, her heart did the same thing, like down to the 30s and didn't recover.
Oh, so that is scary. That is scary.
Yes. It's still like, I've worked through it in therapy now, but yeah, just the room, you could just tell the mood. They were just staring at the monitor with her heart rate. And it was at that point where I was like, okay, we've done it. We've given it our all. Like, this is the right call. So They prepped me for a C-section. Overall, it wasn't terrible. They didn't like strap my arms down or anything. And they did have to do she had descended so far down, so they had to come back through and like kind of push her back up. And during that, my cervix tore, and she came out screaming. And my husband told me it was a girl, because we don't like to find out beforehand. And then they were taking out my placenta, and I heard the midwife and the OB, they were both like, "That's weird. I've never seen anything like that." They're just like talking back and forth and
you're like listening to them.
Yes. I'm like, and I know my baby's okay because I can hear her, but they're just, and I think I asked like, "What's going on?" And the midwife was like, "Oh, I'll come and show you once you're in recovery. I'll show you your placenta." So they started stitching me back up, and I'll get back to the placenta, but they started stitching me back up. And the OB said, he was one of those where he's a great surgeon, but doesn't have, bedside manner. And he made some comment like, "Yeah, you shouldn't waste your time trying to VBAC. Your pelvis is way too small." Oh, and I got so angry. I'm like on the operating table, and I said, "I've already had a vaginal birth." And you could tell he was like caught off guard by it. I'm like, "Obviously you didn't read like anything about me before you just gave me this surgery.
And this diagnosis of you can never have a vaginal birth." But that happens so often.
I know. I see it. It makes me so angry. Like when I see that, because obviously my baby has pushed out.
Well, yeah. I mean, even mine hadn't, right? And he was like, "Your pelvis is too small." But the thing is I easily could have believed him, right? And when you're there, cut open, laying there, vulnerable, and you're told, "Don't ever do this. Your pelvis is too small." Like you want to just naturally believe these providers. I'm not saying that the providers are ever totally wrong or anything, but they give these diagnoses and then we just believe it. So it's hard.
And I mean, and he just like, I don't know what he was using to make that judgment, but it was obviously wrong, as we're going to see. And what my body had already done too. Yeah. And I think he even, like, when I said that, he tried to recover it by saying, "Well, how much did your last baby weigh?" And I told him, he goes, and he said, "Well, I guess your magic number is somewhere between your first baby's weight and your second baby's weight." And I was just thinking, like, I don't think that's how it works.
No, no, sorry, dude.
Exactly. So he got reprimanded, I think, for that one by the midwives. It made me so angry. But anyways, in recovery, the midwife brought my placenta to show me, and it was wild. She said she'd never seen anything like it. It was a bivalved placenta, and there was a velamentous cord insertion in between the connecting tissue. So it was just very exposed, and apparently I had vasa previa too. So whenever their assumption was whenever my baby was turning, it was compressing the cord and causing the heart decels essentially. And so they said it could have ruptured during surgery, if I had actually pushed her out, like it could have been pretty bad. So it was really kind of crazy. She took pictures of it and like texted it to all the people. And she thought it was 2 placentas. The OB disagrees. So there's like the jury, I guess, is still out on what it was. But I'd had a lot of bleeding during the pregnancy. And they had kind of assumed like vanishing twin or something along those lines early on, and they couldn't quite figure out. It just kind of stopped. So they don't know what exactly was going on with the placenta, if it was just, it was crazy. But that was my second birth. And it just was very traumatic. After having such a smooth kind of textbook first birth and feeling so empowered, to have this 12 months later was just devastating. Thankfully, like, my doula recommended therapy, and I got into a therapist and really was just able to work through that birth trauma. Which is one of my big recommendations to people who have unexpected C-sections, is work through your birth story. And there's so much healing in that. And I'm now able to look back at the birth, and it's not a happy necessarily, the happiest day to look back on, but I'm able to see it and, not cry whenever I talk about it. So so that was my second birth. And then now leading into my third, I was determined to have a VBAC, one to kind of prove it to that OB who told me my pelvis was too small, but just for my own, I knew how much I loved my first birth, and I just really wanted that again. And after we got pregnant, in one of my first appointments, I was just kind of chatting with the midwife, and I said, "Oh yeah, the OB mentioned something about a cervical tear during the C-section. And do you know, does that affect anything?" And her face kind of changed, and she goes, "I'm going to go get your op report and read it. I'll be back in a few minutes." And she came back in and said that I had a low-lying transverse scar, but I had a midline cervical extension. So essentially my cervix had torn, and it had torn kind of up to where my C-section scar was. So it was in the shape of a T. Did
the cervical scar tear up into your uterus?
Yes.
Okay.
But not into the contracting part. So it was still low, but it was very hard for me to figure out what exactly it was, because I was trying to Google all these words of what does this mean? And then they were finally able to explain it to me. It was shaped like a T, essentially. And she said she seemed very confident that I was going to risk out of having a trial of labor. And I was devastated, just really upset, but she ultimately left it up to the OB and one of the OBs in the practice to sign off on. So I knew I was going to see him at my next appointment. So I just spent a ton of time researching. I was texting all my friends that are doctors. Nobody knew what it meant. I was searching research articles. I joined the Special Scars Facebook group, trying to find similar stories. And I eventually found a PubMed study that was on cervical lacerations and how they affected subsequent pregnancies. And it wasn't really a T for T, or, well, I guess apples to apples comparison. But I was like, you know what? These women had cervical tears and went on to have vaginal births afterwards. I'm going to take this to the OB and say that so I was just armed and ready. And then I went to the appointment, and he was like, "Yeah, there's not really any data or studies on how this impacts your risk of rupture." And I told him about the study, and he just was it was weird. He was just like, "Okay, yeah, you can have a trial of labor." And I was shocked, because I was just expecting to have all this pushback, but I don't know if he was just more comfortable because it was lower and not in the contracting part of my uterus, or if he could tell I was just very determined and had done my research and was willing to take that risk. But he essentially gave the green light, and then I never heard anything about it the rest of the pregnancy. So that was really exciting. And I just continued during the pregnancy, went to the chiropractor, did dates, did dates 8 dates, drank red raspberry leaf tea, was doing spinning babies, hypnobirthing meditations. I was just trying to get in the right headspace and get my body ready. And then near the end, I kind of started psyching myself out. And in one of my last appointments, I was obsessing about the baby's position because the baby wasn't. What is the ideal? Because it's like LOT, right? Where the baby
LOA.
is LOA.
LOA,
Yeah.
LOA, but OA. I mean, we want baby OA looking down towards mom's back. So as the baby comes down underneath the pelvis, the neck can kind of flex underneath the pubic bone, and then they rotate and create room for the shoulders. But LOA is kind of like a great spot to start because the uterus will naturally kind of like rotate baby OA. So
Yeah, so I think the baby was ROT, where the baby typically turns posterior during labor.
Yeah, so they start on that side because it kind of rotates, back to left to front. And so if you've got a baby that's on the right but looking sideways, which is ROT, which means the baby's back's like on the right but like looking, or like on the right side but like sideways, like in the middle. So if that kind of makes sense, I'm like using it with my hand. People can't see me, but and then the baby rotates. So, but most labors have a high chance at some point of baby going in a posterior position, whether or not they stay there or not. But yeah, ROT for sure. Usually going to have a baby there.
So I was just kind of paranoid, I think, from my previous birth. And I said something to the midwives of like, when she confirmed that the baby, I think it was ROT, I was just like, I can't birth an OP baby. And she just looked at me in the eyes and was like, no. She's like, you couldn't vaginally birth the last one, but this is a different baby and this is a different birth. And she was like, it's the majority of these babies turn and are going to get in the right position. So that just kind of set me at ease. And I started having prodromal labor starting around 38 weeks. And then the day after my due date, I started having lower back cramping and kind of aches, felt like period cramps, super mild. And I said to my husband, lower back pain can be an early sign of labor. And at this point, he just looked at me, he's like, what isn't an early sign of labor? And I think if like looks could kill, I was so annoyed at that point, which in all fairness, I had been telling him every single day for 2 weeks that I thought I was in early labor and it was all just prodromal. So
hey, you were still having laboring signs, and prodromal labor is still labor. It's just not progressive labor.
Right, exactly. So I didn't appreciate his smart aleck remark, but I did try timing them and there was no peak. They just kind of fizzled out. It was nothing. That evening, I lost my mucus plug again. And I told my husband and my mother-in-law, I'm like, I think tonight might be the night. But I really didn't want to jinx it. So I didn't send my older kids home with her because I had done that the last time. And we had to do like the walk of shame where she had to bring our kid back to us because I didn't go into labor. So I was like, okay, we're just going to go to bed. I went to bed at 10:30 that night downstairs in our guest room because the struggle was real with the pillows and getting comfortable and that whole, third trimester routine. So 1 hour later, after I had gone to sleep, I woke up to a contraction and I stood up and immediately heard a pop and my water broke. So I went to the bathroom to check the color and make sure it was clear. And the contractions, they were coming, like this was real. And so I just knew like we need to leave for the hospital like as soon as possible. But the problem was my husband was upstairs asleep and I literally could not walk past our kitchen. I just in our kitchen like fell down to my hands and knees. And I thought I was screaming his name, but he told me later on I was actually just like whisper screaming and he doesn't even know how he woke up. He heard like a weird noise and apparently I was like whispering, but it was weird. And he came downstairs and in my mind, I'm like on my kitchen floor and I'm like, I'm totally getting the epidural. I have nothing left to prove. I am getting that epidural as soon as we get there, which hindsight's 2020. I was obviously like in transition at this point, but he called his sister Thankfully, she only lived 2 streets away. So she was at her house in like 5 minutes. And I told him, you need to call the on-call midwife and let them know we're coming. And he hadn't packed a bag yet. He did not have a hospital bag packed. He's like, I can't call. So he put it on speakerphone, dialed it, and set it down on the floor while I'm like on my hands and knees, like working through contractions. And he's running around packing a bag. So the midwife, she's like, how far apart are your contractions? And I'm just like, they're back to back. Like they're double peaking. I'm like, I can't get off the floor. And she's like, okay, you need to come in soon. That's the plan. We're heading in soon. So somehow they get me to the car. And as we're going, or before we get to the car, I told my husband, like, hey, grab one of those puppy pads that we never used in the closet, because we had just gotten a new car like 2 months before. And obviously my water was leaking. So I was in the back seat, riding on my knees, holding like the back of the headrest. And we get in the car, we start driving, and all of a sudden my contractions start spacing out again. And I was like, oh, this is so nice. Like I'm getting a break finally, which once again, hindsight is 2020. Contractions typically start spacing out right whenever you're supposed to start pushing. So we're halfway to the hospital and my body just starts bearing down. We're in the car and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm pushing and we're in a car. And my husband, he's like, do I need to pull over? But at this point, we're on a bridge. We drove from Louisville over to Indiana to give birth. And we're like on the bridge over the Ohio River, like in between the 2 states. And I was like, no, you cannot pull over right now. And I said, you need to call the hospital and tell them to be waiting for us. Like this is an emergency situation. So he calls.
I might have a baby on the side of the road when we
it might.
Yeah,
like at that point, I'm like, there's no way. Like by the time an ambulance gets there.
Oh, yeah. No, it was probably best to just keep going.
It was just like, keep going. And so he calls the hospital and it's like this lady and she's like, sure, just come in and you can go up to labor and delivery. And he's like, no, you don't understand. My wife is having a baby. And she's just like giving him the runaround. And I finally was like, tell her I'm a 3rd-time mom and I'm pushing. And he told her that. And she was like, one moment, and immediately like transferred him to the emergency room department. And so they said they would be waiting for us. So we're like, okay, good. That's what we like to hear. And so we're almost there and my body is bearing down and actually like pull down my pants and stick my hand down to make sure that I don't feel ahead. Cause I mean, I am like pushing hard and actually I pooped in the car and it landed on the puppy pad, thankfully.
Hey.
So I was mortified. Well, I think I was more, this is so silly. I was like, it's a new car and I just like pooped in our car. But you know.
But we all know like pooping is like a sure sign the baby's coming. So it's not like it was a bad thing.
No, I just, it would have been nice to.
What did your husband say about that?
Later, he actually left the hospital to like go clean out the car like a couple of hours after.
Like, I'm gonna go clean that up.
Yeah, I mean, you would not want that sitting in the car. But he said it wasn't bad because it all was on the puppy pad.
So I just fold it up and throw it in the garbage.
Yep. So it wasn't. So that's my tip for all you listeners. Have a puppy pad in your car just in case.
Yes, puppy pad and a bag or something for vomit. No matter how far along you are in labor, something to do that because you never know. Sorry, my dog's toy is squeaking in the background. You never know when you're going to poop or puke. So,
yep, that very fair. I definitely puked in my first labor. So anyways, we get to the hospital and they're like waiting. I can see like the team, like, at the outside and they like they come up to like the door, the side that I'm on, and she checks to make sure that there's not like a head. And she's like, "You've defecated." She's like, "But that is normal." Like she's like trying to reassure me. I'm like, "I know it's normal to like poop. It's okay." But they're trying to convince me to like get on the gurney. And I'm like, "I'm not laying down on that." I was like, "I will crawl onto my hands and knees." So this entire time, I pretty much have not been off of my hands and knees, right? And so they get a sheet, cover me because my pants are off at this point, and they wheel me up to labor and delivery on this gurney with me like on my hands and knees. And they get up, I have my eyes closed the whole time, and they get up to labor and delivery, and somebody whispers in my ear and says, "Hey, Rebecca, this is Sarah. You're going to be okay." And it was my favorite nurse who was there with my traumatic birth and stayed the entire time. And she was actually a student midwife too. So I was just immediately like put at ease. So they get me up. They know they're not going to be able to COVID test me. So they like put me in like the COVID positive room, like, because they're, you know, obviously not going to stick a Q-tip up my nose at this point. And the ER people just have no idea what to do. So they're like, "Do we need to run a line? Like, should we run an IV?" And, you know, they're like, and Sarah, the nurse, is just like, "There's no time for that. Like, you're not running an IV on her right now." And they're trying to convince me to get over into the like labor and delivery bed, but I don't want to move. And they're like, "We promise you, it's much more comfortable than the gurney. Like, please." So they finally like scoot them like side by side, and I just like crawl over and stay on my hands and knees. And they get the monitors on me, and she checks me, and she's like, "Oh yeah, like you're complete." And I was like, "What station is the baby in?" And she just like laughs. And because in my head, you know, I was complete with my last pregnancy and still pushed for 4 hours. But she goes, like, "The baby's right there. You're like +3. Like, this baby's coming." And in the background, I can just hear like they're on the phone. They're trying. There is no midwife on the premises, and there's no OB. And they're kind of panicking because the first call midwife is like over across the street, like with a birth center patient. And so she can't leave. So then they have one driving from like 20 minutes away. And then the OB that I do not like from my C-section, they call him, and he's on his way. And he was not the person that I wanted to see either. And but everybody's like 20 minutes away. And I said, "I have to push." And she's like, "Okay, you're fine. You can push." And literally push. Baby came out in that first push fully, like no head molding or anything. And I just like laid down. I was so exhausted. And then I like turn around, and they hand her to me and tell me it's a girl, which I was shocked because I thought it was going to be a boy. Just it was such a different pregnancy. But so yeah, the nurse ended up catching her, and I think it was 15 minutes after we got to the hospital. She was born at like 12:26 a.m. and I had woken up to that first contraction at 11:30 p.m.
Oh,
So it was pretty much exactly an hour, and it was just wild.
my goodness. Oh my
Could
goodness.
not believe it. But yeah, so that's the story. It was just a whirlwind.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm kind of scared to have another kid, honestly. Because
Wow.
I'm like, what happens if you don't get to the hospital?
I know. Well, I mean, it happens, and people usually call EMTs and things like that. But yeah, you might have to plan like first sign of anything, maybe going. I don't know. I mean, it's totally like what you want more, like what me do. But
yeah.
Another thing too is sometimes with a history of pretty solid prodromal labor, that like as a doula, if I have a client that has had a week of prodromal labor, I in my mind and kind of anticipate potentially a precipitous birth. Doesn't always happen, but especially for a mom that has had a baby before and her cervix has done the thing, dilated and effaced and everything, prodromal labor can sometimes be a sign that labor could, not always, but could go quickly. And
well, I think I remember reading that like or what I at least told myself was every contraction that I had then, like in the moment, I'm like, this is one less that I'll have later.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know how accurate that is, but it kind of seemed true, at least in my case, like that I had very few. Yeah. It was just so fast, but it was interesting. Like my body, like looking back, it's like, okay, I did not get off of my hands and knees. I delivered on my hands and knees. Like that was, and I think the baby was turning. Like that's what my body knew. Like, cause it kind of felt crazy in my like body. I don't know. Like I felt like she was kind of banging around. I don't know if that's the right. She was obviously like rotating or something, but just like my body like knew like this was the position I needed to be in, and I did not like get out of it for anyone. Like that was it. Hands and knees the whole time.
Intuitive. Yeah. Your body was intuitively going into that position, which I think is amazing. I think it's amazing that our body can communicate to us kind of like that, where it's like, you get in a position, you're like, nope, this is not working. And then you get in a position, you're like, I'm not leaving. This is where I'm staying. Yeah, that is so awesome though. And I love that you're a provider. I love that one, you did research and you spoke with your provider and were, able to have that conversation. And they're like, okay, yeah, and then I also love, this is like not in regards to the laceration, but I also love when your baby was in a, less ideal as what the world says is less, ideal is not LOA, but ROT. That she's like, yeah, like your baby's going to rotate. It's going to be fine,
Yeah.
Because you kind of needed that.
Oh yeah. I think mentally I had hit kind of a wall of, even though the whole time I had been listening to affirmations and getting in the right headspace, but right there at the end, it was all of a sudden like just the mental game, of can I do this? I don't know if I can do this. But I was so thankful because I feel like it really put me kind of over that hump.
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure. Oh, well, awesome. Well, if, you guys do end up having more children, hopefully you make it to the hospital or wherever you decide to birth. Hopefully it goes.
Well, yeah, somebody suggested a home birth, but I was like, a home birth midwife would not have gotten there in time. My husband would have been catching that baby.
Yeah, that happened to a friend of mine where she kind of same thing. It was very precipitous. Midwife was, not even that far, but she also said, I probably waited too long to tell her to come. But she was in denial. She was like, oh, I don't really know. Like, I'm okay. I'm doing okay. Like, it's fine. And then it just like shifted so fast. And I'm like, yeah, you probably should have called her. And she even said that. She's like, yeah, I probably should have called her sooner. But yeah, her husband caught the baby. And the midwife was there to catch the placenta.
See, that's essentially, I think, what happened. The midwife got there in time for me to deliver the placenta at the hospital, at least. But yeah, she was, nobody was there for the actual baby.
There, yep. And that happens. Sometimes these babies, and like you said, like there was no like shaping of the head. It was like baby dropped and rotated and came down. Like, your body did some awesome work. And I love that. So, with your cervical laceration, have you, obviously it didn't necessarily stop you from dilating.
No,
there wasn't any scar tissue or anything like that. Like, have you in your research found that, sometimes when there's lacerations to the cervix that it can like delay dilation or cause issues with dilating?
Well, yeah, and I'd read y'all's article also on cervical scar tissue because I was concerned about that, which they told me. I remember bringing it up to my midwives, and they're like, we won't really know until you're in labor if you have a lot of scar tissue, and if you do, they're like, we might just try to like break it up, like if you're okay with that, or your body will just eventually. They said a lot of times there's a big jump in dilation, so like you're showing all the signs, but you're not very dilated. And then all of a sudden, like you jump from like a 3 to like an 8. And it's like that scar tissue breaks up essentially. So, I mean, I guess presumably there could have been scar tissue and it was just,
it just broke on its own.
It broke open like an hour before the baby was born. Don't really know, but there wasn't any by the time I got to the hospital that was causing issues. Yeah.
Have you had any problems like monthly with pain or anything like that?
No, I need to probably go back to physical pelvic floor therapist. I did go like with my third pregnancy because like halfway through I started feeling like some pressure and whatnot. And it was really helpful. So I'm all about that soapbox too of pelvic floor therapy.
Oh, I
have not prioritized it, but I was telling a friend the other day, I'm like, I don't think things are back to normal after that, like really fast labor and push it. Like, thankfully, I only had like a 1st degree, like superficial tear that they didn't stitch, but it's still, I'm kind of like, after 3 pregnancies, things are feeling, it's not painful. It's just like, I'm like, I feel like some therapy could be helpful maybe.
Yeah, for sure. We're actually we're going to be recording another episode with a pelvic floor specialist here in the next couple of weeks. Yeah. And so that one, stay tuned everybody for that because it's going to be really great. She has a lot of really, really great info on that. So she has so many amazing things just on her Instagram. So that will be good. But, I think, vaginal or non-vaginal, like pelvic floor stuff is really good to do and just tune in and learn how to strengthen and release and all that jazz down there. So yeah, I mean, I've only had 1 vaginal birth, the 2 C-sections, and I feel like I probably need some more pelvic floor love. I've gone, but I probably need more too. So, well, that's awesome. So I was trying to find the PubMed article that you were referencing. Do you know the title of it? Is it the Antepartum Cervical Lacerations?
Yes, it's that one.
Okay, that's the one I found. Perfect. They did like quite a significant study. I mean, there's 81,000, just over 81,000 deliveries in this study. And it said that 131 or 0.16 were complicated by cervical lacerations. So it doesn't happen a lot, but it happens. It says that a lot of the time they get cervical cerclages. So I was wondering if anyone ever talked to you about cervical cerclage.
No, they never.
That's awesome.
Never mentioned it.
Yeah. I have a friend that has a cervical cerclage. She, when she gets pregnant, she starts dilating like really, really, really early, like 18, 20 weeks. And so they had to do a cerclage. Wow. Yeah. But anyway, it says regression, and it says cervical cerclage, precipitous labor.
Really? I totally didn't even know that.
I didn't either. So I saw the precipitous labor and I was like, oh, okay. Interesting. But I think that it's probably because it happens so fast and baby just comes out really, really fast. But like you had precipitous labor the second time and didn't have any further complications. So that's really awesome. Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm going to link this article to the show notes and you can check it out if you guys want to learn more about cervical lacerations and how it could impact future vaginal deliveries. But yeah, I mean, it still looks like many people go on and have uncomplicated vaginal deliveries. So yeah.
Right. And the way it was explained to me too is a lot of times it could happen a lot more than they realize, where if, they knew because of the C-section, but, you could tear your cervix during birth. And if you're not hemorrhaging or bleeding a lot, then they might not even catch it. It might just heal on its own. And that could, lead to scar tissue. So I am curious of if it is more common than we just have no idea,
Right. And that's another thing, even talking about uterine rupture, right? Like there's different types of uterine rupture. There's like dehiscence and stuff. And obviously with uterine rupture, we usually know, but there are probably many times people have dehiscences where it's like really thin or windows, but like we see windows, but like you see it because your uterus, you're cut open, you see the uterus, but like if you don't have a C-section, we could still have windows, but we don't see them. So we might have more uterine windows than we know, but we're just not seeing them. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like if things aren't coming forth in like concern or bleeding and things like that, then we may not ever know. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, in this conclusion, it says interpartum cervical lacerations do not appear to affect the outcome of subsequent pregnancies. So, I mean, that's pretty awesome. And obviously it went up a little bit. So we're going to link the Special Scars group. We'll do our Special Scars blog. And I'm also going to link this PubMed article in the show notes. So if you guys want to go check that out, click on the show notes below and have fun reading. Well, it was wonderful to have you and hear your beautiful stories. And I mean, they're all so different in so many ways. It's really kind of crazy to think about how, you're the same person, but you've had 3 very different deliveries. And I think that is, births, and that's kind of how it can always be. And so I think sometimes as VBAC, especially, or, we're going to VBAC, it's important for us to remember that just because one birth was one way doesn't mean it's going to be the next birth. That's not going to be our story for every birth, because I know it's easy to do because we know what we know, right? We know what we've lived through. And so even you said that, it's just, it's easy to like kind of reflect back or maybe be triggered or things, but just know that every delivery is different. Even though you're the same person, every baby, every delivery, or, every birth is so different. And so try to remember that as you're going through things. And there may be similarities, but it doesn't mean it's the same.
Right. Absolutely.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And I can't wait for the world to hear you.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Interested in sharing your VBAC story on the podcast? Submit your story at thevbaclink.com/share. For information on all things VBAC, including online and in-person VBAC classes, the VBAC blog, and Julie and Megan's bios, head over to thevbaclink.com. Congratulations on starting your journey of learning and discovery with the VBAC Link.